This is part 2 of my totalitarian videos. Part 1 is on TikTok and is on YouTube under e.Teasley, Teasley. So last time I talked about how to recognize totalitarianism through a series of anecdotes about Russia, China, and Rwanda. And today I'm going to talk more about the theory and the observations that I have made about this. So everything I'm going to say here is either through my own experience, things I've learned doing research, or what I've heard from people who I trust. Doesn't mean everyone will agree with me. Some of these subjects have not been covered, some have. I'll be glad to hear from you. So first of all, totalitarianism is like a military. A military reflects the culture it comes from. And what do I mean by that? In Russia, and for that matter in France, there's very little initiative encouraged in the military. In the American Army, however, great deal of initiative is encouraged because we come from a culture that values human life and values human opinions and understands that situations can vary. It doesn't mean that we're always the greatest soldiers, understand me. It's just different. So how different is it? At Yalta, when the Soviets were basically tapping everybody's living quarters, they heard the Americans at Yalta with Roosevelt consulting with their secondary officers, saying, "What do you think about this?" The Soviets, who later published their memoirs when it was possible, said, "I said to my boss," who was, say, a major or a colonel, "Look, the Americans are asking lowly captains and lieutenants what they think." And the boss didn't know what to say, but finally he said, "Well, it's a different system." It's not just a different system. It has to do with the nature of democracy, where we think everybody's opinion could be useful. All right, the same is true of totalitarianism. This is a subject Hannah Arendt, in her groundbreaking study, The Origins of Totalitarianism, didn't sufficiently appreciate. Totalitarianism in each country is a little different. So let's take Germany, which is the classic example, and it's what she lived through part of, but she got out. So she didn't have the full experience. So in Germany, Hitler did not come to power through an election. He was appointed to solve a problem. And I won't go into it, you can read about it. People who should have known better appointed him thinking that they could manipulate him later, that it was a temporary solution, that it wouldn't matter. And he, of course, made sure that there were no legitimate elections after that. How did he make sure of that? And this is the thing I want you to focus on. As in Soviet Russia, as in Maoist China, violence was a part of it. Unlike Arendt's theory, which is that the masses, they were turned into masses instead of being the farmers and the workers and the professional people they have been, that is not true. What happened was the Nazi bully boys, the brown shirts, went out on the streets and beat up everybody they thought could be opposition. And there was opposition. But then there was a thoroughly terrified populace, not everybody, because a lot of people were thinking this Hitler guy could deliver what Weimar didn't. So what happened was that Hitler was very successful at first. Full employment, a sense of purpose, unity. They weren't all thinking the Jews must be punished. They weren't all thinking we're going to open concentration camps. They were thinking this is just one of his little hobby horses, But look what he's doing for the country. He's making us rise off our knees. We can forget that we were defeated in World War I, and they loved it. And even the military, which was very conservative, very Prussian-oriented, didn't like him at all at first. I remember one of the main people that wrote on him said, "This is a guy I would not cross the street to ask for a light. He's such a lowlife." That was Conrad Haydn. Anyway, so Hitler gives them success. Now, he didn't really give them success because the thing they didn't know, which will be my next topic here, is economics. Just like our president doesn't know economics, just like many leaders don't know economics. So what had happened in Germany in the 20s was hyperinflation. I want you to think about this. Before there is totalitarianism, there is a deep trauma. And in Germany, it was the loss of World War I, which they blamed on the Jewish bankers, some of them. And then it was hyperinflation. What is hyperinflation? Bread used to cost $1 a pound. Now it can cost $10,000 a pound. In other words, money ceases to have meaning. By the end of the 20s, things were better, but people could never forget that moment of hyperinflation. This is important because before totalitarianism, there is trauma. And the trauma for Russia is also going to be similar. So the trauma for Germany is both the loss in the war, hyperinflation, and then the Weimar Republic, which a lot of them don't like. And then 1930 comes the all-world meltdown, the Depression. And they don't want that again. And this is what enables Hitler to come to power, because he's got ideas like Mao, like Lenin, like Stalin, like Mussolini. These are ideologues. They've got ideas about what the country should be. But in Germany, because he was successful, he starts to be popular. Now, he didn't understand economics, so what did he do? He invaded other countries to get their gold. For example, Austria. Austria's 1938, and then come many other countries. But in Austria, you had an enormous banking center. You had an enormous transport center. You had a crucial city in Vienna. And once you had that, you had enough money to pursue your war. Now, Germany didn't have oil, so that was going to be a problem, and they were always going to have to scheme to get it. All right, so in Germany, people fall in line. Keep in mind, it's like, I don't know, 60, 70 million, but it's very centralized. Under the Kaiser, it was centralized. Under Weimar, it's centralized. There are different divisions in Germany. This is why Arendt's thing about masses doesn't really work. Yes, there were wonderful Hitler rallies where it looked like the masses were all screaming together, and they were, and the students were being imbued with propaganda, and they were. But Bavarians didn't like Prussians, etc., etc. There were many divisions in all the countries I'm going to talk about. So to reduce it all to the masses, that the people were made into the masses, that isn't really what happened. First came terror, and then in Hitler's case, success. So now we go to Russia. So what has happened in Russia before totalitarianism? They lost at least 2 million people during World War I, which wasn't even in a sense their world. So this was unbelievable. And part of the revolution was, get us out of this war. And the Bolsheviks in the second revolution, the February Revolution, or rather the October Revolution after the February, the Bolsheviks promised, we'll get you out of the war. And that helped, but they would have never come to power through an election. They came to power through terror. And then there followed an unbelievably brutal civil war all over the 11 time zones, all different generals not coordinating on the white side. But the red side had Trotsky. And Trotsky, who would be erased by Stalin from history, Trotsky built the Red Army and was an excellent administrator and organizer. So what Russia had was a double trauma. They had disaster in the war, then they had revolution, then the royal family is killed, and then they have a brutal, brutal civil war in which many sides were involved. So what happens then is you have the Red Terror. So it's not like the people accepted communism. It's not like their minds were molded to communism. For a while in the 20s, Russia has almost a free economy called NEP. But by 29, Stalin is determined, because he's another ideologue, another true believer, just like Lenin, to make this country a true socialist republic. And that requires controlling agriculture. So all of the farmers, and Russia fed the world at that point, especially Ukraine, all of the farmers have to go to collective farms. And what did they do, these people that Arendt wants to call masses? They slaughtered their livestock rather than give it to the government. They knew what was coming. But then the government came to them, confiscated grain, and slaughtered those of them that were resisting, and then sent the rest into the gulag. All right, so we see that Stalin and Lenin are not successful in Russia. They have to institute terror mechanisms. So what is a terror mechanism under a totalitarian? And keep in mind that the Nazis were not half as bad in this way, although they were toward the Jews. But the Jews were like 1% of Germany, as I recall. The Jews were a myth. When they got to the Eastern territories, however, Poland, Ukraine, etc., there were many Jews. They were not a myth, and they were going to be killed. All right, so what happens when you have a centralized government? Russia had always had a centralized government, since Mongol times, basically, because it's the only way to control that large a territory that has been invaded by Mongols and others many times. So they had training. People would come from the Far East to learn how to torture. Everything was centralized. And that's when the education became centralized. But Russia was used to centralization, just as Germany was, and as we are not. So Russia had a czar, and everything revolved around him. The czar was the center. The czar was the holy figure. Then Russia had Lenin, turned overnight into a holy figure. And then Russia had Stalin, who does not become a holy figure until the 30s, when he manages to kill off all of his enemies, friends who knew where he came from, friends who knew too much, friends who could cause trouble. So then we have the Russian Great Terror. And then we have the Ukrainian starvation, and we have the destruction of the peasantry. All right, so these are very different stories. And in Mao's China, 47, it's a bunch of warlords. It's a vast peasantry that is not united by anything, but everybody is so poor. And eventually, the communists win because they're better organized than Chiang Kai-shek. And that's a whole story in itself. But in other words, all of these countries have a slightly different version of what we call totalitarianism. And they do reflect the culture. I'm not going too much into Italy. Italy seemed very important in the 30s. People thought that Mussolini had actually turned Italians into soldiers, which turned out to not be true. Italians were very tribal. It was always lip service with them to Mussolini. But Hitler and Stalin learned from Mussolini how you do this deal, how you do the fascism deal, how you control people. And it does have a lot to do with training and education. Now, the differences are many, but I want to point out from my experience in Russia. Now, my experience in Russia is what you would call mid to late totalitarianism. So there's complete control. Education is completely controlled. The media are completely controlled. America is the enemy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Africa is a friend, Asia is a friend, and they are working very assiduously to cultivate all these ties. They're very international by their supposed nature. But when World War II came, overnight, in the 30s, well, not overnight, mid-30s, Stalin suddenly stopped saying Kazakhs can speak their language, Uzbeks can speak their language, and he's saying everybody better speak Russian, because now we're going to need Russian patriotism. We're going to need you to be a unified people. All right, so this happens a lot, where very diverse groups, and keep in mind that China has many, many ethnic divisions, many, many languages. It is not one group. And let's think about the Uyghurs, 1 million people under control, women being sterilized, etc. Not to mention what happened in Tibet as it was sinicized. All right, Soviets would know what sinicized meant because they did it everywhere. They Sovietized. But by 69 through, 89, when I was in Russia a lot, there were cracks. So what form did the cracks take under totalitarianism? Well, you could be a writer and you could write children's literature. You could be a writer and you could translate. You would write for the drawer, and this happened everywhere. It happened less in Hitler's Germany because they were more enamored of their leader until he started losing in the war. Only then did they somewhat become less enamored, especially Berlin. All right, so under the Soviets and Russia, even totalitarianism, tiny little cracks of freedom were possible to find. Let's say you are a person interested in literature, like I am. You would become a linguist. You would do literature from a linguistic point of view because that seems scientific. What is characteristic of all of these totalitarian regimes is, sadly, they all wanted to be modern. They all wanted to think they were at the head of the development of the world. And of course, socialism with a human face does look like it might be the head of the human world. But if you know economics, regular socialism can't work because of human nature and the law of supply and demand, which everybody managed to ignore because they were very busy taking their countries and saying, I'm going to make you what I need you to be, which is a communist society in which everyone is equal. Was everyone equal? No, not in any of these places. The party higher-ups began very quickly to live so much better than the workers. The workers were exalted in every way except the way that mattered. They used to tell me, they squeeze us like a sponge and they pay us nothing. So that's what happened to the proletariat in the Soviet Union, and it looks like it would have happened a long time in Mao's China. As for Hitler's Germany, the workers got the worst pay. They were not allowed to unionize, but everybody else was very happy. They didn't know they were living off Austrian money and then the money of all the countries that Hitler's armies conquered. So now let me turn to our great theoretician of totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt, who wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism in the early 50s, when she was still in a white-hot state from having experienced some of it. So one of her big themes is something she lived through: displaced people. Now, it's true that all of these cultures displaced people, but it is not true that this was the major issue. The major issue was the inherent violence and threat. When you had lived through the early phases of all these regimes, you told your children, don't ever make trouble. You'll end up in a really bad prison and you might end up dead. So one of my friends, when he was 10 years old, which was probably 1939, his father was a famous writer, Soviet writer. He took him out to the backyard. He's only 10, keep in mind. And his father said to him, you should understand that we live in a totalitarian country, and not all countries are like this. Because the tragedy is, there's always an older generation that lived a different way before Lenin, before Hitler, before Mao. And that generation sometimes speaks. So one of the things with Arendt is she has a series of generalizations, which is completely understandable in the kind of work this is, but they're not true. For example, she says Hitler or totalitarianism only advances the mediocre. That is not true. Hitler had superb generals some of the time. He had Speer, who was his minister of armaments and did a great job. He had Todt, who built everything. And he had von Braun, who we then would take to get to the moon. And von Braun is very interesting because when he was asked about the Jews and asked about Germany, he never answered. He's had one answer that covered everything. He said, I think it is normal when you want your country to win. Well, we needed him. We knew that he was a Nazi Party member. We probably knew he was a true believer, but mainly he was interested in science and getting the rockets to the moon. And we correctly took these people, many of them, into our world to use as experts, thinking that they had something to teach us. And they did, but it's going to always be a moral gray area. So not everybody in the Soviet Union at the top was inadequate, but as time went on, nobody believed in the message. So what you had was an entire population, not unlike under Mao, but different from Hitler, that lived a double life. And this has been written about by many of their writers, by many of their memoirs. At work, they would hew to the party line, but at home they would go, this is all bullshit. Nobody believed in Marxism, Leninism because it didn't work. You couldn't get soap. Everything was in short supply because by the time a party group said, this is what our plan is economically for the next year, this is how much wheat we want, this is how many cars we want to produce. By the time it got done, the loss of supply and demand had made a joke of it. It was just, you can't control an economy from a centralized source. And they never learned this. They knew it, they lived it, but they didn't know what to do about it. So when Gorbachev came and opened the door a little bit, they kicked that door down and said, we don't want this system anymore. And in the 90s, Russia had the closest thing to freedom it had since the 1890s. And then came Putin, and then came reassertion of a centralized power. Now, why does totalitarianism come? As I said earlier, there is trauma. And you could say our move to the right was partly because of COVID We had 1 million people die. Everybody forgets that. And we had an economy take a big hit during those years. But before that, we had the 2008 meltdown. These things have long consequences. It takes a while sometimes for it to hit. So our turn to the right is related to these things, and it's all over the world. The world had COVID. And I do believe that this has something to do with it. This is something Arendt didn't go into much, but when you have a trauma, the danger, for example, in Turkey, after the Ottoman Empire is wrecked by World War I, the danger in all these places was that things fall apart and that there is no powerful government anymore. So when you see things fall apart, the natural instinct is to assert some kind of control that will make things cohere once again. And that control can be dictatorship. And in the worst case, people with ideas, ideologues, it'll be totalitarianism. Okay, that's the end of my second and probably last video on totalitarianism. Thank you.